Welcome to 21st Century Saints.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here again.
Again, yeah. Tried once. We did a practice run. That's what we'll call it. So I think I nicknamed this a corridor conversation last time we spoke, because I think certainly people who are used to going to church are used to the juicy conversations taking places in the corridors, maybe in the car park, on the journey into and out of Mormonism. That's where all the gossips happen, isn't it?
It is, and you can speak freely in hushed whispers. And particularly, I think that's where people who are starting to have issues with things at church find each other and have a little chat and have the real conversation, or feel able to open up. I mean, I still see it at church today. You know, there are people who will loiter in the chapel rather than go to the lesson. And it's so important because in a way, you can see that the most important conversations are going on there, and the ones that are most needed for people's ministering needs and so on. That they've found someone they can trust to speak to, and have that, unburden whatever's on their minds or that they're struggling with.
Absolutely.
It's so important. You can't over correlate everything. I think this is one of the many sort of challenges the church is facing at the moment that's making it less appealing is there's less and less space for social interaction and for the actually religiously important conversations and emotionally important conversations to happen within the officially approved curriculum. And the more you do that, the more you kill it. It loses its spirit.
So I was
Let's have a corridor conversation, Ruth.
Shh, don't tell anyone. So I was listening to a podcast recently. It was one that Jane had been on with a panel of women, and it was really powerful. And I can't remember who I'm quoting here, but one of them was talking about having a child with disabilities, and that meant that they couldn't actually access a lot of meetings because that child needed to be out of the meetings, and all of us to some extent are go through periods of time where we feel like we can't access the meetings in the same sort of way, whether that's because we've got young children or there's some sort of extra needs going on there. But I think there comes a point where maybe from a spiritual point of view, as you say, it's not always safe to go into those meetings when you don't feel like you can ask the questions that you actually want to ask, or challenge the status quo of what's going on in those meetings. So that's why I wanted to have this conversation with you, Peter. So obviously you are sitting in a place of now being excommunicated, but you still attend church. So I think one of the trite phrases that often gets said to post-Mormons or people who were once Mormons, former Mormons, is you can leave the church, but you can't leave it alone. So why can't you leave it alone, Peter?
Yeah. That's a really good question. And it's an important one to ask. And it's a whole hard space to fill, because it's a bit like people who are mixed race. They feel that they don't fit in either group, and they exist in this kind of awkward twilight zone where it's hard to feel comfortable either way. So if you are attending church while being a dissident, the people there are uncomfortable, even if they love you, are uncomfortable that you're there and worried what's going to happen. The people who have just got fed up with the church and left are also confused by, like, why are you bothering? And I do get that asked that regularly. And I'm really glad I get asked it, because I need to be clear and with myself, and I need to in having integrity, you need to kind of be aware of why you're doing what you're doing. I think the reason for me is there's a kind of a mixture of why I'm still trying to be present at church while podcasting, encouraging revolution, really encouraging radical reforms, and including information that is being hidden from people about quite how corrupt the church has become. And it seems almost impossible from the true believing brain to understand why you would, in a sense, be an enemy or hostile to the church in some way, while loving it or while wanting to be with it. Like, what are you doing? Because there is no buffer zone of tolerance at all in Mormon culture for dissent or for rational criticism or critical analysis. It's just almost all gone, and so you're dealing in, certainly there in that situation, the people who just don't get it and are perhaps never going to get it, or they will eventually, but then it'll be too late for their testimonies, you know.
Yeah.
So I think the reason, the main, I mean, there's a few, but the main reason for me is I feel I'm able to go, and I'm lucky to do that. I'm not raising small children right now. I'm a middle-aged person. I'm an empty nester. So whatever difficulties I encounter at church are only going to affect me. I'm not endangering my children with what they're hearing there, which is the reason a lot of people can't be in this position, because they'd have to bring the family with them, or deal with that in ways that I don't have to. I feel it's important as much as possible to keep in touch with what's going on in the church. If you're going to be advocating for reforms, it really helps to be in the room. And it gives you two kinds of opportunities. It gives you an opportunity to read the room, to get a sense of how things are being thought about and said at church, what has hit home from what the apostles have done and said, what hasn't. Because it's the people there in that space that you're trying to reach and help, or protect. And the other thing is, it gives you the opportunity to actually be the change a little bit. I don't think, I mean, I think there's a lot of people who get very bogged down in battles within their ward. You know, I've got some really good friends who'd be amazing podcasting dissidents, but they they're not seeing the bigger picture yet, or wanting to, and that's entirely up to them, step larger. So they usually bring their issues to church, and they get involved in lots of quite heated debates and battles, trying to resolve what they can see going wrong with the church with their local leaders. And the local leaders really are powerless to do much about it, you know. So I do, in that sense, I don't go there to try and have it out all the time with the locals, but I will push back a bit if something is said or expressed or done that is unhealthy, just to try and raise awareness a bit. They see it as some raging lunatic, I'm sure, at times, coming in and screaming apostasy, because there is no buffer zone of tolerance. From our world, we know in 5 minutes we could destroy everyone's testimonies like a nuclear bomb with the information that we have. They have no idea how much we're restraining ourselves.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's a
to not
kindness
blow
on
it
my
all up
part that I
every
don't go
Sunday.
to testimony meetings.
Yeah,
I don't think they'd
yes.
want me to bear testimony.
Yeah, I mean, like, it would be carnage if they really kind of appreciate, and that's a shame. I think it's a shame that they can't, they're not in a position to really understand how much we're being kind and protecting them almost like children, which you could say is patronizing. You should just tell them the truth. But I don't know, it's a difficult path to walk.
Yeah.
So, but you know, I've had some amazing experiences with being able to have those conversations, by being present, by going to the thing. I've ended up having a one-to-one conversation briefly after a fireside with Keith Erickson, who is the visiting, you know, the church history department's director of historical outreach. He came and did another fireside in Crawley recently. I was able to ask him face to face my question, and I've got his email address to send him some follow-up. That wouldn't happen if I wasn't there. You know, I can criticize him from afar. I can phone in on his broadcasts that he did to the nation during the British rescue a couple of years ago. But to actually say I've had a conversation face to face is really cool. And another example that happened recently is that a few weeks ago I was kind of getting a bit frustrated with Elders Quorum, because we've had some missionaries back. Our little tiny ward has experienced not having missionaries for a couple of years, and it's the death of a ward because there's no growth, and it feels awful, and things just trickle away. And this is going to become increasingly common because there aren't enough missionaries now to put one in every congregation. We've had some amazing missionaries, just lovely, keen young men, really doing it for the right reasons, and they've got some converts, and they're doing so well. Everyone's super excited. Like, I think probably top baptizers in the mission, which isn't much, but they're pulling it off, and so I've sort of agreed, and I do this anyway, not to be too controversial when we've got new people or investigators there. But for once in Elders Quorum, we didn't have the newbies there, and I was sort of talking a bit about my why. That was the theme of the conversation, and one of the things I said, someone asked me, well, what do you think we need to do differently then? And I said, well, for a start, you're baptizing black people. There's black people joining our ward.
Have
Has
you
anyone told them
disclosed
about the
anyone
history of the
history?
racism? Have you told them? Is there any way, because I think they probably haven't. And we all know that and you don't have to be black to be really upset about this stuff. I remember when you and Sarah were talking about your experiences in a recent 21st Century Saints discussion, you both talked about how finding out about the history of racist segregation in the church rocked your worlds and was a
Hideous.
major shelf item. And certainly for black people, this is an issue, and the longer you leave it not telling people, you're not inoculating them, and everyone gets far too embarrassed to say anything. And
Yeah,
it's awful. If someone says this to me later, it's a cataclysmic disaster. So I'm like, this is just one example. Have we thought ahead? Have any of you told these people about this history and helped them to kind of resolve it so that they
yeah.
hear it first from you?
And I'm
Um,
I'm not
and
opposed to people
yeah,
joining the church,
sorry, go
but
on.
I completely agree with you.
Yeah,
And as a convert myself, that
yeah,
process should include all of the information. And if that can't be achieved in 6 weeks, so what? If it takes 6
make it longer.
years for
Yeah,
somebody to feel
yeah.
completely confident that they know everything, they're happy with
Mm,
it, warts and all, they
mm,
can wrap their head around it
mm,
and nuance their way through that information. If they then still want to sign on the dotted line, don the white jumpsuit and jump in the deep end, so be it. But I feel as
mm,
what rocked my world wasn't just the fact that hideous things had happened in the church's history, but that they chose to lie to me about that. Because
yeah,
as we know,
yeah,
we've done the repentance process at church enough times. We've taught children in
mm,
primary. A lie of omission is just as much a lie as a lie of commission, or you
mm,
chose to withhold information, church
yeah,
organisation, not my little missionaries, not even probably
mm,
my young
yeah,
women's or Sunday school teachers at the time. They didn't know that stuff, but the church certainly did. They've known it since at least B.H.
mm,
Roberts, and they chose not to.
yeah. Go,
That broke my heart. Yeah, yeah,
Gospel Principles has an amazing definition of lying, and it very strongly includes withholding information.
yeah,
Like, sins by omission and withholding information you should share,
yeah,
which is why they don't teach this anymore, of course.
yeah.
Um, and and that's it. I mean, it's so big. So anyway, I mean, it all got a bit fraught by that point in the conversation. I wasn't able to really follow up. I just sort of made the point. Have you? And I'm grappling. I'm like, okay, I'm sitting here pontificating in my podcast. So, and I've just done like a long series about Ahmed Corbett and the history of racism and gaslighting it in the church. Do I have a moral duty to go up to these new black converts and their teenage children and start the conversation and ask, has anyone told you about? Because, I think where you say you can take, I mean, there has to be a cut-off point. I think it's reasonable that if you're committing to a religion, you're not going to know all about it from the beginning. But I think we can probably all agree that if you're a black person joining this
That's
church,
kind of
that for
fundamental.
most of its history
Mm,
was racistly segregated and is still excusing that.
yeah,
And the next prophet in line, Dallin Oakes, is teaching it was God's will.
yeah,
We just don't know why. I think it's reasonable that they should have heard about that. So anyway, that was left sort of hanging in the air. Then 2 weeks later, one of these black families had been baptized, and the mission president came to church, the president of the London mission, who I hadn't met before. And so he was in Elders Quorum, just a little group of us. We were chatting away about different things. I was able to make contributions. I have to give huge kudos to our Elders Quorum president, who used to be my bishop in a previous ward. We've got a long history together. And although we butt heads sometimes, he always goes the extra mile to be welcoming when I turn up at the door on Sunday. and to give me opportunities to speak, when I'm being reasonable. And he's a great example of reaching across that divide of discomfort. So I guess in what I was saying, the mission president was impressed enough to sort of understand I'm a thoughtful person who cares about the church, sort of thing. And after the lesson was over, suddenly everyone went, and it's just me and him in the room. I'm like, this is an Ensign story. You cannot believe this. I kind of said this to him because I think he knows sort of who I am a bit and my reputation. I was very open with him. I said, who I am. I think I mentioned I have a podcast, and I've got lots of concerns and I try to address them and that sort of thing. And he was just lovely. He was gracious. He was good at listening. He gave me a lot of time. I mean, this is a guy who's turned up and there's a baptism straight after, and he sat and talked to me for about 25 minutes. He didn't need to, he didn't have to do that. And a lovely guy. So I said to him, I've got, just since you're here, there's something I was just wanting to ask the mission president, and you're here. It's like a miracle. So I said, bearing in mind, the history of the church with Black people and so on, and that the church used to have a script for missionaries to put them off joining if their investigators were Black. Like they literally had a script they had to say to Black investigators to kind of filter them. Give them a heads up, but I think also hopefully put them off joining because they didn't want them around. Do you have any kind of training, or do you give the missionaries training about what to say to Black investigators about the racist history of the church? And he said, well, we do talk to the missionaries about difficult things. And his predecessors were actually really woke. They were amazing. They had LGBTQ people talk to their missionaries. They had Detod Christofferson's brother, who's sort of out and gay, has come back to church, who was a friend of theirs, speak to their missionaries and so on. So there has been some efforts there. But it was very clear that they didn't. No.
It's
And
not
he
part
said,
of the program.
no, exactly. And he said that that usually it comes up when the investigators ask them or friends of theirs sort of talk about it, and usually in the more urban areas. So what he described as being reactionary. And I said, if it comes up,
It's not
they'll
good
have to
enough,
talk
is it?
about it.
Yeah.
No, of course not. I mean, it's insane. So I said, well, do you have an actual program? Do you train them what to do and how to discuss this? Because it's a really big issue, and it causes a lot of faith crisis. And he said no. And he said, and what was really interesting, what he said next was that it's really important that things are consistent across all the missions. So he doesn't feel he can innovate anything. He can't create something to meet that need. And I had real mixed thoughts about that. On the one hand, I was delighted to hear that, because most of the stories of people being really harmed by mission presidents is when the mission presidents go rogue, that they go off piste, they stop following the program and invent their own things based on their own ideas, which are usually not well thought through, or they become a fanatically controlling. So the fact that he clearly got drilled into him at mission president training, you do not do anything different to the program, was a good sign for those reasons.
Yeah.
But also obviously a problem, because
Huge problem.
doesn't give you the flexibility to adapt to local
So we
needs.
have it drilled into us not to question leaders, and that was really emphasized, I think, at this last general conference. You can basically throw out any past scripture because it's only the current prophets. I know I'm inflaming that sentence, but basically,
no, that was an understatement.
Past prophets to question current teachings of prophets. So therefore, you might as well just don't even bother taking your scriptures with you, because just look to the current prophet and they'll tell you what you need to know and what you don't need to know. And I think when it comes to programs like this, they are waiting for men in their 90s to make forward-thinking, progressive decisions, and we should not be surprised that they can't. And I think it's a little bit like the word of wisdom being for the weakest of us. It's almost like the programs of the church are designed, will progress and improve at the pace of the slowest of us, who happen to be men in their 90s, who haven't had their finger on the pulse probably most of their lives because they've been kept in this little bubble of privilege. Are we surprised that things don't change? Are we surprised that they would rather Peter Bleakley's sideways rather than say, do you know what, let's
actually
listen
you've got a point.
to what you've got to say.
Yeah.
So
So
how
I just encouraged him. I said to him, just finished sort of that story, I said to him, look, you innovate something. You know, there's also a mechanism here for that. The church loves a new program that works locally. It will be in the national training videos within a year. So, and they do have pilot schemes. So I just sort of challenged him a bit to, well, maybe think about it because it does happen. I don't think he can break anything by trying to forewarn black people about, you know, the history of the church as investigators have a way to frame that. And otherwise, they're just dropping the missionaries in it from a height. I mean, always in these conversations, you come away so frustrated that they think they love their missionaries, but they're throwing them to the wall.
So vulnerable.
There are obvious problems, and how are they going to feel when their black investigators eventually find out and have a faith crisis and leave? I mean, it's setting them up for pain.
Or any investigators, to be fair, because
exactly.
You know, I don't have to be black myself to feel very much that was wrong, and that if Heavenly Father loves all of us, that can't be true. That can't be right. And the church itself has stepped back from that position of less valiant in the pre-existence and all of that nonsense, and said, oh, we're not quite sure why we had that now. In the gospel topic essays, we know why they had it, because they were racist at the time, and it took a long time for the racist people in the church to be not quite so much in control. But even still, the loops that they jump through to try and make it make sense is more damaging than just saying this was racism. There was racism within the church. It was not from God. We were wrong. That is less damaging to the reputation of the church, and less damaging to missionaries, less damaging to converts, less damaging to members as they try and make sense of that and walk themselves into huge issues. But so,
and that's the thing, isn't it, Ruth? You can see that. I can see that. Anyone with basic common sense can work that out in 5 minutes. But the institution has become such a fossilized monolith, you're not even allowed to think it. And that's why it's insane. So what I got that, ultimately that my usual long waffly way was to answer your point of why am I still going? I got to sit down for 25 minutes with the mission president of the capital city of my country and my whole region. And I know I told him about that. If he was oblivious to that issue before, he at least heard it from me. That helps me a lot because I feel I've done what I can to try and be that change, and it's up to him now. But maybe that will start a chain of thought. Maybe that will get him thinking about it. And that wouldn't have happened if I wasn't there.
I'm trying to think about that. So obviously I've stepped away from the church, and I think it's so interesting that you feel a much greater responsibility to try and save the church from itself. And when I say the church, I mean as an organization, not as in necessarily the current leadership or structure of it necessarily, but that you find something of value there that you want to protect and advocate for, even though you have been quite severely sidelined from a spiritual point of view. They've sort of cut you adrift. I was just thinking back, so what I wanted to ask was, do you remember people being excommunicated when you were young, because you've grown up in the church? What would have been your view of an excommunicated person when you were in your teens or 20s, perhaps? How would you?
It would usually be some dreadful sexual sin or something, or adultery, or I wasn't really aware of people being. I mean, you'd sort of hear of a few people in the past being excommunicated for apostasy, but it was always sort of pioneer era stuff, nothing particularly recent. But then the big turning point for me, which was kind of the beginning of my radicalization, was the excommunication of the September 6th.
Right.
So I'd grown up in the church, always quite intellectual. You know, my friends and I were proper Mormon nerds as teenagers. So we would get hold of anti-Mormon literature and debate it and discuss the issues and try and work out refutations of it. We talk about deep doctrine. This was the era before President Hinckley really got going with a Back to Basics campaign. So, I mean, during the 70s and most of the 80s, if you were a faithful member of the church, you had the journals of discourses on your shelf because there was almost nothing else to buy. There was no internet. And you just waded through that to get your obscure answers to your questions. So people were just out there in La La Mormon land trying to make every word of the journals of discourses all work as a whole, because our very naive assumption was that none of it contradicted each other.
We were told that,
So you
though.
had
We
these,
were told it. Why would we doubt that?
yeah. It was amazing, but it did make space for wild conversations and freewheeling doctrinal speculation. It was half the fun of being a Mormon if you're a bit intellectual, you know, if you were there for the ideas, not just the community, which a lot of us were. Um, so that was cool. But after almost when I at the end of my mission, I stayed with a friend. My family came and got me, and we toured around a bit because I'd been born in Utah. I was born at Provo. My British parents met at BYU in Provo, in Utah. Got married, had me, graduated, and came back home to Britain when I was a toddler. And it was the first time I'd been back, you know, so to go on my mission in the Florida Tallahassee mission. So they came and picked me up in Alabama. We did some time in Mexico. We did some time in Utah, and they were catching up with old friends as well. And I was visiting. I think it was then that I was staying with or visiting with one of my companions in Logan, and went to the Logan Library. And there I found a bunch of Sunstone magazines. Um, it was either then or when I went back to visit a year later. And I just went mad photocopying. I'd never heard of this. This was like incredible stuff. This intellectual Mormonism I had no idea even existed, with great cartoons and news and gossip and, you know. And so I went mad with the photocopier, and my mum and I subscribed to it, and we just devoured this stuff. And what I didn't realize was my mum, who was constantly on a spiral, being stake or ward relief society state president and primary state president, and very involved in public affairs in the church as well, that she'd always been a bit of a feminist rebel. She subscribed to Exponent too, which was sort of the feminist Mormon magazine, which I'd only started to sort of clock when I got older. And I've just found, clearing through some of her books, some an edition of Dialogue. Like, Mum's got Dialogue, Journal of Mormon Thought, volume 43 on her bookshelf.
Fantastic.
A lot with of anti-communist sort of as Taft Benson stuff, but anyway. And so we just devoured Sunstone, and very quickly, it was the early 90s. So I finished my mission in 1991, and it was 92 or 3 that Boyd K. Packer excommunicated 6 intellectuals, the September 6th, for daring to tell the real history of the church and publish and teach it, or to discuss Heavenly Mother and female priesthood and what each of their sins were. And this was a clear signal being sent to stop thinking as Latter-day Saints, to stop thinking about the next steps for our theology, to stop
Yes.
investigating the fact that we've been epically lied to about the history. And the people within Mormon studies say it put a chill on them for a decade. It kind of set it back. Patrick Mason who's sort of a quite young Mormon studies historian, said in one of his, I think his Mormon Stories interview a little while ago, that he's only in his job and his generation of quite young historians because the previous generation got erased by that purge, and people shied away from going there, and they've kind of picked up the pieces, and they're the only ones doing it, and suddenly they're in senior roles.
Yeah.
So I learned very quickly after my mission that I was actually on a team. I learned that there is a civil war in my religion, And I'm on the side of the dissidents. I'm on the side of the people who tell the truth about the history. And the people who are lying about the history are the prophets, seers, and revelators and their
Does that
curriculum that they
tickle your
authorize.
brain a little bit though, Peter, that you
Yeah.
could look around you and realize I am faithful, I'm a believing member, and yet I'm diametrically opposed to people that I feel like I should be trusting wholeheartedly, but I don't trust them to tell me the truth. It just feels like topsy-turvy land, doesn't it?
I think for me, the reason it didn't throw me straight off at that point, as it does many people when they have that epiphany, is I wasn't expecting much better. I've got your basic common regard and British racism against Americans. Like, Americans are kind of like puppies. They're really cute. They're really enthusiastic. You're not expecting them to be that bright. And you just love
I thought you were going
them.
to say they're going to pee
They're
on the
like,
carpet. Let's hope not.
well, that as well. There's some of that going on. But you just love them because they're so happy and cheerful, and the British state of mind is not to be. And
Yeah.
hence we love our American missionaries. They're like our wacky nephews from abroad. Um, and there's always been a kind of almost a bit of a distance. I think growing up in the 70s and 80s, you built up a lot of resentment where all the stories and scenarios in the primary lessons were totally American culture based and nothing you could relate to at all. Endless stories about the ethical dilemma of when the quarterback asks you to be his homecoming queen at the prom, and everyone in your community knows that means he wants to bonk your brains out later. What do you do? And we're like, we'll say no to the stupid jock, obviously, but you
Yeah.
have no sense of the American cultural expectations.
Yeah.
This is
We're
like
like,
being
prom? What's
invited
the
to the
prom?
royal family. Yeah, I know. Yeah, what's the prom? What is necking? I mean, I never
Yeah.
knew what the hell necking was, and petting, all of that, and just all these stories were like they didn't even care that we existed in other countries, and Britain's quite close to America culturally. So there was that resentment of you kind of learn to take what the Americans do and say a bit with a pinch of salt. But in a sort of loving, we love our pets. We love our pets in Britain, so we love our Americans. So there's a bit of that. Also, the culture in my family, which I now realize is very rare, was one of total faithfulness and commitment and hard work for the church and saying yes to callings, and we're going to be at every meeting. We are reliable, although we always turn up late. But Bleakley thing. And but at the same time, we're capable of critical analysis. So in the old days, when you had loads of meetings during the week, you'd have Sunday school in primary in the morning, and then you'd have sacrament meeting in the evening. You'd go back to church later. So if we had a visiting speaker, some bigwig visiting from the stake or from regionally, they'd often get invited to our house for lunch. So our half-time show for church on a Sunday, as often as not, was to have amazing dinner guests. And these are the leadership class of the people discussing the issues, talking, they're gossiping. There's no social media. This is the only way anyone finds out what's going on out there. And we're used to talking about it. So I was used to both at once, of both loving the church, celebrating it, being committed to it, but also particularly my mum would get very feisty about the way women were treated a lot of the time. And she'd come home and she'd have a major habdad at my poor father. He'd just sort of take the brunt of all her rage against the patriarchy. Um, and so we were very conscious that, that it wasn't just we're faithful and we trust the leaders and they're perfect. It was we're faithful to Jesus, we're faithful to our religion, we want our church to do well. Today was an absolute shit show. Why did it go wrong? And what can we do to fix that?
Okay.
What was wrong about the way the bishop treated that woman? What was wrong about how that lesson went? Therefore, what can we do better? Who do we talk to? How do
Yeah.
we make this go better next time? How can we be more professional in how we run our church? So I was always able to kind of step back and be a bit meta. I was trained by my parents to be analytical and see and not trust the leaders like they are infallible gods, and if they do anything wrong, that's the end of my religion, it's a car crash. It was, I wouldn't expect anything else from them. They're human leaders, you know. I was taught
Yeah.
to
And
nuance that up from the
I
start.
think that's where I was for a long time, until
Yeah.
I personally came to the conclusion that there's too much right in the very roots of where this version of Christianity has come from that is wrong, to try and fix it. But I know that you have a different opinion. So if you had to sort of,
Yeah.
if there was a mixing pot of ingredients that you're throwing in from the, I love my analogies, from my ingredients shelf of Mormonism as it currently stands, what's going to go in
Yes.
the mixing bowl? What are you keeping and what are you leaving out?
Yeah.
And please leave out sultanas, because I
What's
hate
going
sultanas.
into the fire?
But yeah, what are you putting in?
Right, I'm getting rid of sultanas, racism, lying,
Yeah.
stealing's bad,
I mean,
charity fraud, that
it's
can
a low
go.
bar, really, isn't it?
Yeah, hypocrisy, the things on Jesus's list, you know, in his
Yes.
Sermon on the
Yeah.
Mount.
Yeah.
What does it leave? And I think that's really good. And I think particularly when you do learn about the history and realize even the foundational stuff has been lied to about. You know, you can have a narrative of the church like it all started well, then it went apostate, but you can go back to the early Joseph years and everything's fine. You know, there's this
Yeah.
sort of pure, pristine early version.
I've
And the
I've yet
church
to find
teaches that narrative about, yeah, the
it.
church it was in the primary manual. You just needed to pay more
Yeah.
attention
Okay.
before, you know, read something correlated, Ruth. You'll find it all there.
Okay.
Um, and so it was kind of and that's how the church taught Christianity was. It started all perfect with the early apostles, and then it went apostate for 2,000 years, and God did practically nothing until now about that, which is
Yeah.
kind of ropey, isn't it? So there's that way of looking at it. But when you then discover, and I mean, I've only been able to even begin handling this and still set foot through the door because it has been years of incremental discoveries, you know, having the willingness to research and read around the subject and get into the social media groups. And every day kind of used to bring a new shock. It's like, you're kidding me. Is there anything left? So if
Yeah.
you take the foundational truth claims of the church, the first vision, well, we now know that that wasn't mentioned by anyone until years after the church started. You know, early Mormons had no idea about it. I mean, you wouldn't believe that from, and I shared that with someone who was one of the high counselors at my excommunication, who's an old friend. Um, he mentioned there in the discussion we had at the Court of Love that when I shared that with him, that the first vision accounts came much later. I didn't realize this. I was just chatting to him about why I'm a dissident, really. And he'd gone home and I presume researched it a bit more. And he and his wife went through a real crisis over that. I had no idea that happened. But that's just one example of a long list, you know. And so, well, okay, can we have Mormonism without the first vision? Book of Mormon translation. So, okay, a seer stone. Joseph Smith was a treasure digger. It was, they messed around with things. Things got retrofitted into the text of the Book of Mormon, or you know how they played it. Okay, priesthood restoration. Then let's go for the authority, which is another of these pillars on which the restoration is meant to be built, that you teach as a missionary. There's no record whatsoever of the Peter, James, and John visitation from near the time. No one knows the date. I was interested to know early on in my research that Richard Bushman in Rough Stone Rolling kind of speculates that it may have happened when Joseph and Oliver were on the run from jail. They'd escaped from prison. And that he had, you know, Joseph kind of gave Oliver this guided spiritual experience kind of to boost his faith, or as a blessing in adversity.
Yeah.
And when I read that, I was like, that's the version of Mormon history that keep the kids in. If you want to keep the teenage boys entertained, don't talk about the restoration of the Melchizedek priesthood happening, you know, as it was a lovely sunny afternoon while we were translating the Book of Mormon and thought we should go and get ordained. So we took a towel to the river, and John
Once upon
turned
a
up
time
and
when we were
stuff.
on the run from the police.
Yeah, we were fugitives from jail. After breaking out of jail, Joseph and Oliver were hiding in the forest from the police and their hounds. Wow. You know, the real, if you've not come across it, the Naked Mormonism podcast is a mind-blowing hoot. It's like church history as gangster western. Just with by Bryce Blankenagel, who's got one of the coolest names in Mormonism. And absolutely check out Naked Mormonism. It's just you know, the stuff that really went on was wild. But anyway, so there's no first vision with credibility. There's no priesthood
We've not got the
ordination like as a
priesthood. We've
priesthood.
not got the first vision.
Joseph made that up later, and his fellow apostles were horrified. They were like, "You've never talked about this before. All you talked about was high priesthood. There was nothing about Melchizedek. Why are you retrofitting this now?" And you can see literally how that was retrofitted into the Doctrine and Covenants from the early publications of the Book of Commandments around D&C 20. And the Book of Mormon translation is all extremely iffy, and the nonsense we were told about it, and grew up swearing there was nothing to do with the seer stone, none of this occult nonsense. So what is there? What on earth is there to hold on to keep when it's all, and very quickly segue to polygamy, you know? For me, and this is my last bastion to hold on to, I would say there's a set of 4 or 5 really amazing good ideas that Joseph Smith did come up with, whether he hybridized them from other people or not, and particularly what they could do for wider Christianity. Looking at my sort of journey religiously has been very much in a context of larger Christianity, really conscious that I'm a minority in what used to be a bit more of a Christian world when I was a kid. I mean, it's not now, but it used to be. I experienced persecution, I experienced discrimination, I experienced people being suspicious of me or having assumptions about me because I was a Mormon that were not real and were nasty, and based on stupid propaganda rather than the accurate propaganda. And I kind of took it on the chin. Even though I was very shy as a teenager, I went to Christian Union at school. I joined Christian Union. I was like, I'm a Christian. I'm going to hold my ground here. So I've kind of been doing this thing for a while, in unwelcome environments, you know.
Yes, I was going to say.
And yeah.
Samuel the Lamanite must have been a story that appealed to you,
yeah,
Peter.
exactly. Yeah. And my RE teacher was really, you know, very ignorant and a bit hostile. And I did again after my mission at college. I joined Christian Union. It was brilliant because there were hardly any Mormons around. So it was a great way to actually tap into a healthy, living community of fellow students. And I loved it. And I'd been in the Bible Belt for 2 years on my mission, so I could handle a Pentecostal, you know. And that was really interesting how that played out. So I was used to actually trying to be present with the best young, committed Christians from other, you know, churches, bringing the best they've got, bringing their enthusiasm, their hope, their missionary zeal, and all of that. And really, it was still hopelessly inept and inadequate compared to what I was used to at church. I really started to appreciate. I used to be a kind of anti-structure, anti-manual, anti-control person. But when I saw how incompetent a lot of these churches were without our basic manuals, without a teaching manual, without systems, without a missionary program, without missionary discussions, they were hopelessly ineffective, rubbish at building up convert baptisms or what to do with a convert in many ways, really bad at communicating their stuff, pretty dull youth programs. And I really saw how much had been invested in us as young people in the church, how they got it right to talk to us seriously very young and educate us. Seminary was intense. Back then, you had to actually read the scriptures, which they've just got rid of. You know, so you did become very informed about your religion. You thought you were informed about the history, half of which turned out to be a lie, of course. But the scriptures, you learnt and lived in, and that teaches you, including the bits they'd rather you didn't read. And that's powerful. So
you
what
seem
I
to say
think we offered the church was, sorry, other Christians, was a view of the world that's bigger than the Bible. You
yeah,
know, that God speaks to all people in the world and cares. I mean, that's a global vision.
yeah,
The idea that revelation continues should be, you know, I know it's a Mormon cliche, but it's still a really powerful one. That scripture should continue. Why not? Miracles should continue. Of course, they're not actually doing them when you look too closely, but the idea is there. The idea of our human potential was the biggest one for me, because the most I was, you know, particularly among, and I know it's not all Christians, but among sort of Calvinist influenced Pentecostal evangelicals in America and in Britain, they have a very passive view of salvation. You can't save yourself. Your works don't count. God decides randomly to intervene in your life and save you if you're lucky, and then you're magically transformed and you're saved forever, even if you backslide and start sinning. None of that made any sense to me, and it's a cruel asshole God who's arbitrary in who he chooses to
mm,
save. And these are religions that have been around for 2,000 years. That's the best they've got, really. And Joseph Smith absolutely powered through that. So we have in Mormonism the answers to the fundamental theological dysfunctions that destroy the credibility of mainstream Christianity.
mm.
It's a huge treasure. It's
But
a great gift.
I
We
think we
have a lot
also
to
have
offer,
though some of
but we're screwing it up.
the
Mm,
worst possible character traits of people that call themselves Christians, and
mm,
that's what I find so disingenuous,
mm,
because
mm.
at the same time that the church has lent into, don't you dare call us Mormons, you've got to call us by the full name of the church because we're Christians.
Yeah,
They
yeah,
are
yeah,
so very much against the actual Jesus of his own words, allegedly in the Bible.
yeah,
That, you know, the closest we
yeah.
have got to any
Mm,
historical narrative of him was he was a dissident, he was a table turner, you know, he pushed back at authority, it
mm,
got him killed.
mm,
And all of those
mm.
character traits have been congealed into this great mess that is Mormonism, which in no way, in my mind, represents the
Mm.
freedom fighter that was Jesus of the Gospels. Now, what I would also say is, stepping one big step back from Mormonism, does it make you want to step back from Christianity and explore other religions
Mm.
with more of a
Yeah.
critical mind, and kind of go, okay, well, that's
Mm.
Christianity, which, you know, we arrive at in one
Mm.
way, but if we can look at the whole of human experience and world
Mm.
faith views or no faith view,
Mm.
is there
Mm.
value there that actually has more value to offer the world than Christianity does? Or do you feel like, no,
Yeah.
Christianity is my baseline, and I go from there?
I would say philosophically, Christian Mormonism does the best of both worlds brilliantly. Again, I'm not pretending for a moment the church is practicing this or anyone in the top Q15 have the first clue about this, but they are squandering the gold that they are sitting on doctrinally. You know, they could be winning the 21st century with an inclusive big tent Mormonism right now, and that, as you've pointed out, nothing they're doing relates to that even slightly. You know, but they've become the Pharisees that Jesus fought against. You know, why did they teach us for years to read the scriptures of Jesus the rebel and then expect that when we grew up we wouldn't rebel, that we wouldn't do that when they chose to start behaving like the baddies in the scriptures, even in the temple endowment, they do the stuff the Lucifer character does in the temple endowment, buying security in the world with money and gloating about that.
Yeah.
Um, why did they not think we'd notice and rebel? Because we've been trained to by all these heroes in the scriptures, by Jesus, by all the martyr prophets who stood on the wall and called out their sins. Why did they think we wouldn't get that message from what they taught us? So the correct way you're right. So there's a few sort of ingredients to how I'd respond to that. First of all, I taught religious education for several years at my school, which was fantastic. It was an opportunity, I was doing it for about half of my timetable for several years. I'm normally an art teacher at a secondary school. And it was a wonderful opportunity for me to learn much more about other faiths than I had before. And to appreciate the commonalities. I'm about halfway through reading the Quran, and there's which is a very dry book. It's a bit like Doctrine and Covenants, where it's all commentary and no story. Um, but you just see at the heart of Sikhism, of Hinduism, of all these religions, both the commonalities they have of prioritizing compassion and justice and mercy, but also all of their hypocrisies and corruptions. The caste system in Hinduism is endemically racist, which is why the Sikh guru Nanak rebelled against it and kind of went a different way. There's good and bad in all these religions. I think there's a problem for people who become disillusioned Mormons with holding on to Christianity, because when you've learnt all about Jesus and God through this church, if you find the church is massively corrupt or failing to live up to that, why would you still hold on to their God? Why would
Yeah.
you still hold on to their Jesus when they keep teaching you that you can't detach the two? You referenced Elder Haney earlier in the recent conference and other speakers recently who've been literally saying what the prophets say is the same as your loyalty to God and Jesus. There's no difference. They are the mouthpieces of God. There's no caveats. There's no point, Haney said, working out whether they're speaking as a man or speaking for God. I mean, they've ruled that out now, when that used to be the big caveat. We're all encouraged to make that distinction. It's horrific. So when Mormons lose their faith, their families panic, and you have these uncomfortable conversations with your siblings and parents who say, well, do you still believe in Jesus? They kind of throw away all their doctrine and want you to still have some kind of relationship with God,
Something.
because
Yeah.
that will comfort them. They'll be horrified if you go atheist. They at least want something, an ember to keep burning that they maybe can convert you back with later. Or even they might be happy if you attend another church. I've seen that play out in my extended family, because at least they've still got religion. There's a hope there. Um, and you just have to explain, like, why should I believe your God? Because I've found out your prophets are lying bastards who've committed every sin and crime in the book, um, who taught us this God. When have you ever told me or when have they ever said there's a difference between loving God and loving us and our institution, our priesthood, and our authority? But
Yeah.
also, you've slandered all the other Christian churches. It's fundamental to the conversion process to Mormonism
To
to
burn
learn
those
about the
bridges.
apostasy, to burn all the bridges with other churches, because they're all corrupt and you can see
Yeah.
it. And someone commented in a thread, I think in Reddit or something yesterday, it was brilliant, just said, when you've seen how the sausage gets made, you see it in every church you go to. When you've been burnt by authority figures and hypocrisy and corruption in our church, you'll see it where it is in the others. The grass
Yeah.
is not green.
And I think as well, once you have reclaimed your own judgment and reclaimed your own autonomy, you're not so quick to give that over again. And certainly like I say, as a convert, having gone through that process and willingly handed that over to somebody else, to hand it over to an organization and said, take care of my heart, but I'm trusting you to tell me the truth and to be honest and show the integrity that you're telling me that you've got as an organization, that you do speak for God and that you are in communication with him. You are his mouthpiece on the earth. I'm handing all of my trust over to you. Once you've taken that back, you are not quick to hand that over to another organization. You can see goodness in other people. You can see lots of truths and faith-inspiring messages within other organizations. But I think you're absolutely right. It's very, very tricky then for a member of a very controlling organization like the Mormon churches to freely give that away in any hurry.
to their credit, and in a sense to recommend that path as what does work for a lot of people, we're so used to having far too much demanded of us in our loyalty and time and money that actually a lot of other churches just won't ask that of you.
That's right.
And
Yeah.
in Mormonism, you see that as a weakness, but it's actually a strength.
Yeah.
If you're going to pop up at the C of E church down the road, they're not going to demand 10% of your income. They're not going to do any worthiness interviews with you ever, or your children, ever. That just doesn't
Right.
happen. And, you know, when you're so used to it being part of your church life, you can't imagine that. And then how do they function? Isn't everyone sinning? It's like, oh yeah, they are, but they get forgiven, and that's what church is about. And you know, you can opt in as much as you feel comfortable or not, and they've got someone else being paid to do most of the ministry stuff. So you're
Mm.
not having 20 callings in the week and being expected to be hyper serve.
Mm.
So it is in lots of ways much healthier to attend a church like that, and maybe just get used to the fact that you can do Christianity more on your own terms as you describe, and only
Mm.
buy into it as much as you feel comfortable with, and their organization will be delighted with that
So
and
do
not
you,
interfere with that.
could you
And they have a different
imagine,
philosophy. It's not their job to say to control you. Yeah.
can you imagine a future where that is Mormonism, where you can
It
just
will yeah.
go to whichever congregation you
Yeah.
fancy,
Yeah.
come along, sit
Yeah.
down, have a chat, feel community, feel some spiritual
Mm,
uplift, but not have that huge expectation of you've got to buy into this, you've
mm,
got to pay your 10%, you've got to
mm.
buy in with your time, you've got to hand over your
And
children
declare
for an
certainties in your
questioning.
testimony. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Mm,
All of those that you've got to do, all of
mm,
the sort of
mm,
work to prove your loyalty to this
mm.
organization. Could you imagine an organization of Mormonism that allowed you to just come and be? I don't know.
Yes, it's called the Community of Christ.
I knew you were going to say that. Well,
There's
it's
some people
true.
already doing that.
It's true, isn't it? I mean,
Um,
that
yeah,
is a really
yeah,
good comparison that they've been on this journey and that's where
yeah,
they've ended up.
yeah.
It does look a
Mm.
lot
It's
healthier.
holy envy, isn't it? Yeah, there's a spectrum. So I think my view, I wouldn't actually go as liberal as Community of Christ, because I don't think they have strong enough unique truth claims to change the world, and they are shrinking as well. So they don't have the total answer, but they certainly model for us things we can learn from within the same tradition, how to really do common consent, how to they're learning a lot about how to evolve things and embrace the future and make changes that they need to without losing half their membership, which they did originally. So there's a lot there. Yes, I can absolutely imagine this. I think there are a lot of people doing it. I do it as an excommunicated person. There's another person who's excommunicated in my ward who still attends regularly
Mm.
and finds spiritual food and community, and it's a big family. Um, there is there'll be more of us than the not excommunicated soon. There,
You have to have
there, yeah, yes,
separate rows.
yeah,
This
you,
row gets the sacrament,
yeah,
this row
you,
doesn't. They're the naughty ones.
yeah. You have the PIMOs, the physically and mentally out, who
Yeah.
don't believe it but are there because they're families. It's still not a comfortable experience for them because they have to listen to fanatics being certain and demanding all this. So the rhetoric doesn't soften,
Mm.
but in their own minds, they've worked out healthy boundaries and what they're prepared to buy into or not. So there are people who are doing that, but the church will, if the church in the future is going to exist, it will have to get there. Otherwise, it won't exist in the future. And I think that's another reason I've still got some energy for this struggle, is it's really not going to be long. Even John Dehlin has now kind of had an epiphany, even though we've been talking about it here in Britain for ages, that the
Mm.
church is screwed. You know, the collapse is starting to hit Utah as well, where
Yeah.
it's been going on here for a decade already. And it's a lot ringing alarm bells because they are seeing for themselves for the first time how fast a ward can shrink in just a few years from 150 to 40,
Yeah.
which is what's happened to my ward. how quickly it happens. When the kids go, you have no future. It spirals fast, and then you don't have people going on missionaries to replace the ones who go. We used to have a kind of slightly growth model equilibrium where we baptize thousands of people and about 10% of them stay active long term, and that's just enough to replace the people leaving and keep a few.
Right.
And so that with incredible effort and huge attrition, whereby every ward in the country has got 500 people on their rolls on average, but only 40 or 50 coming, that you still had growth. But now the internet has blown up the lies. The people leaving is accelerating at a pace. You're not keeping the young to send on missionaries to replace the people who leave. And as soon as you've lost your youth, that's it. And I watched this happen to the Church of England, and I'm just flabbergasted at our church's stupidity and not learning from that mistake.
Arrogance.
The
Is that
CFE,
just
yeah.
such arrogance?
Well, just unwillingness to. Well, I think Richard Bushman put it perfectly in that fireside that they sacrificed the children for the grandmothers of Sanpete County. They're always pandering to the elderly old faithfuls and not upsetting them. But in doing so, they entirely sacrifice the future, which is madness. And we watched the Church of England do this. The Church of England refused to modernize. It did not, some evangelicals tried to make their whole thing more relevant to young people. They created discussions, these things when I was at, I think, the Alpha course, which was pioneered by I think Holy Trinity Brompton, an Anglican church in London, as an introductory course to the religion called the Alpha course, which is basically their version of our missionary discussions, came in while I was at university. And it was like, yeah, finally you're learning. You need a program. This is something Mormons can teach you, how to have recent converts pick up a manual and function. They can teach lessons because you provide them the resources to do it. And they were just trying to reinvent themselves, guided by the Spirit every week and getting nowhere. So sorry, I'm spiraling on.
No,
Wait, what were we talking about?
Well, all I was going to say is that I see Christianity, certainly in the UK, through the prism of imperialism and empire building. And I think even down to early Christianity hitting the UK through Holy Roman Empire, all of those sorts of things, it's been a vehicle of building empire and changing culturally and creating links to somewhere distant, and then controlling people's lifestyle choices, controlling how they marry, how they interact with the state. Christianity, whatever your belief is in its, what it holds, whether it holds truth or not, has been used as a vehicle of imperialism. And I think when we see the Mormon version of Christianity as a vehicle of Utah imperialism, it worked up to a certain point in time. And I think you're absolutely right to pinpoint when the avenues of information became so much easier to access. And it wasn't a case of going to Lighthouse Bookstore and actually meeting the Tanners and saying, okay, well, what is this information that you hold? Where is this that you've photocopied and spiral bound? Where have you had this from? It is free flowing of information. Then that empire that you have built dissipates so very quickly. And even if you're doing it for all of the right reasons, you can't use those same control techniques anymore, because the same control techniques that came off the back of World War II, where they embraced that whole Mormon missionary haircut, which came out of your sort of serving your country to serving your church, and you've got to be clean shaven, and you're going out there and you're our army and you're going to go and change the world. And you're going to become cookie cutter Mormons all across the world. And I'm going to go on a rant here, our patriarchal blessing is going to rip out your cultural links to your nation of birth, because we're going to tell you who you related to and how your past before this world is and how your future post this world is. We're going to rip up the books on who you are and where you come from as a country. That worked up to a certain point. And then I think in just the same way that people question, rightly so, Great Britain's historical narrative about it being great, the world is definitely questioning America's narrative about it being, you know, great, number one, all the rest of it. And any religions that are then associated with those nations go up in, you know, become debatable. And I think when you think about the missionary program, a missionary program that can bring Christianity across the world, some people might want Christianity, but a missionary program that is there to change people and to make them homogenous across the world, I think we have to put a big question mark against, because I'm not sure that that's ever what Jesus of Nazareth intended his message to be. I think it was about love and acceptance and compassion for
particularly if they're marginalized and people who aren't fitting in the fold. And I think Hinckley and Monson, while in the brief moments of his presidency didn't have extreme dementia, they got it. The I'm a Mormon program was all about that. It was all about promoting the idea that members of the church are diverse, interesting, counter-cultural, not stereotypical. They have tattoos. The mum goes kickboxing in Colombia. You know, the people who are profiled, it was wonderful. And I felt it was as much educating the Mormons themselves that they could be this diverse as it was telling the rest of the world we were. Because, of course, it's totally wildly inaccurate. They literally sifted the members for the really quirky, unusual, articulate, sort of out there ones with a slightly alternative lifestyle to feature. But that was brilliant. I mean, it was a boss move. If you want to reform your over conservative organization, give them that identity. But then the backlash has been spectacular. Nelson calling all of that a victory for Satan and shutting it all down and making everyone get pious about what name the people use for the church, and just creating the barriers again and being nihilistic, and it's the end, which means we're going to go to war with the world. I mean, it's been fast and brutal, which is why I frame my podcast and why I see all this as a civil war. It's ruthless, and it's the same. And again, a positive for Mormonism philosophically is it's always framed this struggle like that from the pre-existence, the foundations of our religion in the narrative of our belief system, our mythos, doesn't begin in the Garden of Eden with a woman screwing it up for everyone, which has been very bad for women within the Christian culture. It begins with a democratic debate and a vote. God is democratic. He allowed his kids to choose what plan of salvation they'd go with, and he trusted the majority to choose the right one, or what he'd discovered to be the better way to go. And the right one is freedom to take risks and choose and think for yourself and learn for yourself. The key ingredients of Lucifer's evil Satanism are control. You don't allow people to think for themselves. You force them to be good. You force people to be good. And this is something my mum was always really militant about. You cannot force people to be good. She was always allergic to the Phariseeism of, if we add these 20 rules to everyone, that will make them good. And it's our job as stake presidencies and bishoprics to give everyone lists, which they did. I remember we had a state newsletter in the 90s at some point, which had, and I kid you not, 3 separate lists of 10 things everyone was meant to be doing as the state goals. And it was just, and it crashed and burned. No one was able to think like that, thank goodness, or do it. And eventually that state presidency learnt their lesson. And the last couple of years of their administration was a complete philosophical change to trusting people to govern themselves. And that was a wonderful lesson in how the Phariseeism doesn't work. And you, as you get older and wiser, you move towards radical Christianity and freedom and leading people. And when I said, I mean, this is a good place to introduce Joseph Smith's Best Ideas. There are some scriptures in Mormonism that you'd have to tear from my cold, dead hands before I give up on this religion. And they are specifically D&C 58, which says we've already got permission to be anxiously engaged in good causes. You're damned if you wait to be told what to do, which is the complete opposite of the whole philosophy of, as you've described, of waiting to be told what to do in the church by the leaders. And the other is section 121. This was Joseph Smith at his lowest point, in jail for years, well, months. His family and friends are all being persecuted and murdered and raped and all kinds of horrible things. He's feeling totally helpless. He's feeling that he's a victim of unjust exercise of power. And out of that comes, in a couple of letters that got cobbled together as section 121, this big rant at God. Why aren't you saving us? Why aren't you intervening? Why aren't you making it right? And then it's, peace, my son, you know, justice will be done. Don't obsess about that. That will take care of itself almost, you know, karma. Here's a lesson for you about how power should be exercised. Any degree of unrighteous dominion, control, guile, manipulation, forcing people, doing things for prideful motives. The second that happens, I, God, withdraw all authority or priesthood from that man.
Oh, and
The
that's such a good
way,
game, but that's Joseph Smith to a T.
I know. Well, you could argue he had. I know
people.
he had a moment of epiphany. Maybe he was facing himself, you know.
Yeah.
And the only way that you can lead, and this is a seminary scripture, this is what they taught us as 14-year-olds, and we got it. Why can't they get it in their 90s? It's maddening.
Well, I think
Was
that
gentle persuasion with truth. You speak the truth and you gently persuade people, and it's up to them whether they believe you, but you don't ever refer to your authority. And everything these leaders are saying now is, because I have this ordination, this authority, this apostleship, therefore I am the mouthpiece of God. Therefore you must be loyal to me, even if you know I'm wrong. I mean, it's the opposite of those scriptures, but those scriptures were written by Joseph Smith. So I think the only way, in a way, to rehabilitate Mormon history is to stop overclaiming that it's this perfect restoration of the perfect religion and these people were innocent and holy. It is the wonder of wonders of the Christian religion is, despite our dreadful sins, and some of us being the worst kinds of sinners, God can still teach us truth and he can still do amazing things through us. But the only way to deal with that on a historical timeline is at every point be incredibly honest about the failings and the sins and repent of them. Say, we're on a journey. And this is what Mormonism, as I understand it, is meant to be all about. The whole plan of salvation is this. Of course, we're not perfect. Of course, our prophets are not perfect. We're all idiots fumbling around in the primitive form of our evolution. But if we choose love, compassion, forgiveness, and radical honesty, we can work through our shit. We can resolve our sins. We can learn from the mistakes of the past. But you have to teach them as mistakes, not make excuses for them and blame other people. And that is the fundamental, most basic fundamental error that these idiots running the church have done, which is why it's crashed, why it's going nowhere, why it's going backwards, why they're driving it off a cliff, because they don't understand their own religion on the most basic level. They don't understand Christianity. So I love Mormon Christianity for those reasons, because they are radical ideas. They're revolutionary. They're democratic. They're all inclusive. The Book of Mormon has a verse that says God has spoken to every people, not just descendants of the Israelites, every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. They have scriptures. So where you said, what can I learn from other religions? The Book of Mormon gives me permission as a Mormon to absolutely embrace all the religions, cultures, tribal myths of the world and sift them for wisdom, for goodness and truth, to respect them, to see God there, not just in our tribe and our church.
So when you talk about those, you know, when we've seen it, and within our lifetimes, we've seen that situation where current prophets turn on a dime and throw the teachings, the structure, even the beliefs of former church leaders completely by the way, and would have us as members just, you know, sort of pivot, and we'd get whiplash from this strange relationship we have with current leaders. And I think instead of, for me, the part of the shelf breaking process was recognizing, hang on a minute, if there is a God that is leading this, that's at the helm, that is using them as mouthpieces, they can be fallible, they can, you know, forget to do something or misspeak or, you know, growl at somebody or
adultery occasionally.
that's by the by, but the actual message, the narrative that should be coming through them should be consistent and have consistent truths and consistent love and consistent empathy and kindness and generosity, because it's coming from a heavenly Father. Surely that's what we're being told. And what I'm seeing is more akin to the sort of Greek gods of old, where you've got these 15 men battling it out at the top of a mountain, and we are the little toys being played with, and they don't care if they knock a load of us off the playing field. They don't care if a load of us are knocked into the sea or burnt up or whatever it is. We're just part of their power struggles with each other. It's nothing to do with us. And that's when you start to feel like, well, hang on a minute, I'm stepping out of this game. You guys do you.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You do you. And if I can offer compassion and kindness to people who've been on a similar journey, and I think that's where I sit in 21st century saints, because obviously Jane and Sarah are in a different space spiritually, but I accept them, they accept me, because it's the walking wounded almost. We're not letting those guys battling it out between themselves, fighting over whose toy they want to play with, affect us. And I think you're absolutely right to point out that Hinckley did some good stuff, Monson did some good stuff. I'm sure most of the leaders of the church at some point did something of value for the organization. I would just argue that it doesn't demonstrate to me that they are acting as mouthpieces for a higher being, because I should be able to hear that consistent voice throughout all time. And we've had 200 years now of them turning and turning and turning and turning and changing and hiding stuff and then reinventing things. And I think that's enough time to evidence that they aren't actually being led.
I would say, but they're doing it all wrong. The way it was established at the beginning was common consent. No doctrine, idea, or anything was meant to become official without first being debated in front of the members, as they used to do, and then voted on. So you have revelation in the proper Mormon model comes through a democratic collective revelation process that Community of Christ are trying to model better now. So again, yes, I agree with you, but they're doing it wrong. They're not even following their own scriptures. So they aren't Mormons. They are Pharisee Mormons, as useful a name as anything for them, because they're exactly doing the things the Pharisees in Jesus's time that he critiqued did, and how, Christianity is specifically defined in opposition to the Pharisees and where they'd got by the time they'd become corrupt in Jesus's community. And it seems the church had this fork in the road. The internet hits like a bombshell. Suddenly all the skeletons in the closet are everywhere for everyone to see at once in the world, almost like the second coming of Christ is meant to be. Suddenly all the dark secrets they've been hiding are fulfilling prophecy, being proclaimed from the rooftops through the satellite dishes and the internet cables. And they can no longer hold the narrative, which they were trying to hold, that the prophets have always been compatible. The way we were taught to handle the history of the church and everything that's taught and the changes was the things that are really true are the ones that didn't change, but the things that kind of got left by the wayside, that was them speaking as a man, even though at the time when you check the documents, they were claiming it was revelation. So how would you know the difference? But that was the narrative. That was the way they just about held things together. But now they can't control that. Instead of going the Christian Mormon path of acknowledging sin, repenting of it, apologizing, saying, let's learn from this, which they tell us all to do in our own lives. They'll teach it in primary. You sin so that you can learn from it and move on and do better. But you can only do that if you acknowledge it was a sin, are honest about it, try and make any restitution you need to, and do your best not to repeat it. But you can't ever escape from that sin if you don't go through that process. Instead of that, these nut jobs like Haney in the last conference, but also the whole of the first presidency, Eyring, teaching that it's a sin to speak or even think of leaders having human weakness, and if they are being wrong, it's for God to judge them, quoting George Q. Cannon, who is a lunatic, and from about 100 years ago. Oakes, there is no loyal opposition in the church. President Nelson, the prophets and apostles always speak the truth. You can trust them completely. I mean, they're all claiming the infallibility. But to make that work, you then have to have poor suckers like Haney say, right, well, the way it is then, you just go with the latest prophet. So they're updating, they're rebooting the religion. As you said, you've got to deal with the whiplash of 100 U-turns, left, right, and center. They will contradict themselves. I mean, this is a lot of the content of my podcast, is tracking them contradicting each other, contradicting previous scripture, contradicting themselves in the same talk. They are idiots. They're just, it's a mess. How is anyone meant to navigate that? And all they can offer as a way to hold their followers is switch off your brain.
Yeah.
Stop caring that we're teaching you the opposite of what we taught last week. Stop caring that the allegedly eternal endowment written as a script by Jesus before pre-existence is being changed every few months by our prophet, and that he is changing the covenants and the ordinances. But begin the new endowment with the statement, the ordinances and covenants have not changed, when they obviously have, or been removed or added. And so you then get this insanity of Haney getting up there and saying, well, never mind all the old stuff, never mind the scriptures, it doesn't age well. Stop
Yeah.
comparing what the living prophet's saying with what previous people said.
Literally,
And
comic
it's
books are
been
of more value.
incremental. If he'd got up and said that 20 years ago, there'd have been a riot, because
Well,
it'd
it
be
wouldn't
so
have.
completely antithetical to everything that we understood our religion to be.
It wouldn't have
But the
been
fact
signed
that
off
he
on.
did that, no. Well, it wouldn't, exactly. The
Yeah.
fact that he got up and said that shows they were happy for him to say that nonsense, because it is in harmony with what the first presidency are doing and how they're forcing these poor underlings to do mental gymnastics and break their own integrity and psyche to talk such nonsense and think
Yeah.
in these ways.
Yeah.
But it's been incremental. They've systematically tweaked, and part of what my podcast has been about has been tracking the journey. Who first said this? Who then quoted that person a year later? How did they add a little bit more? How is this? And it's you can track it. It's
Yeah.
been an intentional process to get people to completely reverse their religion. It's been a total U-turn, ethically, rationally, all of it. And what you've arrived at is Lucifer's religion. You will just obey us, whatever we do or say, even if you know we're wrong. It doesn't matter, because I am God. I am your God. I am the mouth of God. We, they keep going we now, which they didn't used to. It used to be about the prophet, but now they know the prophets are so old, they will get dementia eventually. They want to have the backup credibility for the teams. So it's not like we're rudderless. It's okay, we've got 14 other prophets. So they always talk now about all 15 being prophetcies and revelators. And it's just the last stage of a coup d'etat for total cult dictatorship.
Yeah.
And
And that's
people who
terrifying.
trusted to be more rational are going with it and making excuses for it. It's horrifying. And that's why I want to go and watch, because
Yeah.
I'm also
This car
morbidly
crash, it's
curious.
terrifying to watch, isn't it?
It's a
Because
car crash. Yeah.
it's watching it in slow motion, because they're only, in the 90s, they're
Yeah.
very slow moving people now, but they are absolutely driving this off of the cliff. And it's painful to watch, because there are people there in those congregations that I love, that I care about, that I know this is probably breaking their hearts, and it's also breaking their heart that I've stepped away, that my family have stepped away, that you have stepped away. We see it from both sides, but us saying, yeah, you're right, we just need to knuckle down and get back on the Mormon train is the right approach. It isn't, because where it's going is in completely the wrong direction. And it's terrifying to watch. And I think I personally can't see how these guys, or the people that are moving up into position behind them, who are totally church broke as well, how they could ever have the guts and the integrity to say no further, we need to change direction here, this is completely wrong. And they're too wealthy. They've said the motivation will never be we need to do it for money. And they genuinely, I don't think, care about the numbers, because they'll lie about the numbers, and they will argue black is white if they have to justify what they're doing. And who I feel for as well, to some extent, is those people that are in positions of working for the church. So church historians who can't actually be historians, who can't actually study primary sources and say, this is what was written, this is what can be inferred from it, who have to approach it from a point of view of, this is what they want me to infer, and therefore this is what it's completely the wrong way around. And then you'll have church apologists who are flavour of the month at this point, 5 years, 10 years down the road, they are
they'll be
dropped, excommunicated, lose their pensions, all the rest of it, for doing what the church wanted them to do. And I feel sorry for them, I think, but it's predictable, because you can see it happening wave after wave after wave throughout all the history of the church, right back to Joseph Smith and how he treated a lot of the early members to get his own way, to move things in the direction he then wanted to go towards. And I find it quite terrifyingly sad, but also you do sit there with your popcorn, don't you, kind of going, what on earth can they possibly get wrong next? Oh, here we go again. There's something new to add.
It's endless. It is endlessly entertaining and vindicating, because it's like, we're not, it used to be you were putting 2 and 2 together from very little actual evidence. You'd hear a little bit about what someone said in a private fireside here, and a little thing there, and this hidden document the other. Now they're just saying it in literally general conference. You don't even have to go to anything flaky or dubious. You just quote general conference at people, and and they're not seeing it. It's that open. Can I suggest 3 things that could break that system, though? Because you're absolutely right. By the time people get near the velvet throne, they get so tantalized by the idea that I could be the one being the boss, even if they've got ideals still, which most of them haven't by then. They're more, if they start to question the authority of the person who's boss, when they're boss, they won't have carte blanche to do what they want. So you can see how, when they get close enough to reach out and just about touch being president of the church and all that power, they don't want to, in a sense, break the spell of being president of the church, because they'd like to be treated by like royalty when they get there. And President Nelson has been absolutely open, as has his wife, about that's exactly what happened. She said he's unleashed now. All the things that have been annoying him all this time, he can do something about. She's such an idiot. She gave it all away. Normally they at least pretend to have respect for predecessors. It's incredible to watch. It's satirical. It's farcical. I mean, so there's that whole like watching spitting image sort of aspect to this. But what is going to happen is 3 things I would suggest. First of all, on the historians, and I'm planning an episode about this, they already do that. It's exciting. I can't remember his name. One of the younger historians was interviewed by by Book of Mormon Central or someone. Saints Unscripted, I think it was. And they kept trying to draw him into making some wild faith-promoting statement. But he basically said, I don't trust anything unless I can look at the original documents, and I'll base my beliefs on that. Thank you very much. And they didn't realize what he'd said. So the historians who's still in there, if they don't start becoming corrupted like Heath Erickson clearly is, they are, in their own minds, the way they're staying sane is by being honest and true to the evidence. And they're writing the true history now, and they've got more of a buffer zone to do it. So that, that's how they're doing it. Keith Erickson, I'm really disappointed with, because a couple of years ago when he did all these firesides on Zoom answering the difficult questions. It was revolutionary, and he was very honest. But I watched him in action a year later in Crawley State Conference a few months ago, and he was gaslighting the whole way. He was giving the weakest, most faith-promoting responses to every question. And I was like, you've lost your integrity now, haven't you? And I watched him do it. I was really disgusted with him because he seems like, but I think what's happened is he's got this role to interface with the public and their questions, which the general authorities are too chicken to do. So they've given him the job as director of historical outreach. And he's realized he hasn't got good answers for any of this stuff, the racism, the whole lot. And people have still got the questions. So he's now got his patter down of the most distracting, useless. He's not helping anyone with the answers because they don't hold up thing to say. And I was really disappointed because I'd seen some hope there. So there's that. The historians are actually secretly rebellious. You know, if you actually listen to what some of them are saying, they get it. You know, it's all wrong. Yes, rebelling by telling the truth. But I think the other two dynamics where, yes, what do you do in your organization when the leadership have taken all power to themselves, they have no accountability, and they're determined not to change? And anyone they promote to power must pass the test of also being determined not to change. Well, you vote them out. You enact democracy. We still get 4 opportunities a year to vote. So if we wanted to, the members of the church can replace all of them. But they have to believe it first. Like all revolutionary movements, Black consciousness had to happen before apartheid was deconstructed and the civil rights movement. You had to teach oppressed people that they have rights they didn't think they had and how to use them. And when you do raise your head above the parapet and start rebelling, they'll set the dogs on you, they'll turn the fire hose on you, they'll come and shoot up your South African township. But you have to keep taking to the streets and protesting, and you have to win. You have to have that determination that this is the future and it's going to change. So at some point, if it's going to happen, the members do have the power to bring that change about. What will trigger it? My theory, my working theory, which I fully acknowledge is highly unlikely to happen, is that there will come a point in the next couple of years where in enough wards, in enough stakes all over the world, they realize all of their youth have gone, that their own children are leaving the church because of what the general authorities are saying, not because of what the wicked world tells them, not because everyone's losing their religion. I'm really fed up with that narrative because America did have really high attendance at church until recently, and it's collapsed. But what they don't know is the rest of the world did that years ago. The Western world lost its religion 2 generations ago. Yet during that time of loss, our church grew like Topsy in Britain. We grew from tiny little pokey branches to thriving wards, while everyone else left their Baptist and C of E and other churches because they wouldn't change and be relevant. And we were finding ways to be relevant to real people's lives. So if that moment of epiphany comes, there need to be enough local leadership people who just say, hang on a minute, this is ridiculous. And we, who've already had time to think through all the options as an ex-Mormon community or a nuanced Mormon community, need to have a script for them ready to go, because it's going to have to happen quickly before everyone just leaves. They need a fast, simple, easy solution to bring about change, which is why I think my personal journey in doing the podcast and everything has been to find out what happens. Why is my church dying that 3-4 generations of my family have sacrificed everything to build? Why is the congregations that we spent decades building up to ward level back to where they were in the 1970s numerically? Why, who's responsible, and are there easy solutions? Because you can get bogged down in it all. There are hundreds of historical reasons to lose your faith. There are hundreds of dysfunctions in how we do pretty much everything. The missionary program, the failure to safeguard children, the dishonesty still about the history. All of it is a tangled mess. Are there simple solutions? Yes, there are. Vote, just vote. Vote opposed. Vote opposed to these people over and over again. Say why, and then give people the chance to change it. Teach them that this used to happen in the church. There is Mormon precedent for removing leaders or forcing the apostles or prophet even to do something they didn't want to do because you voted against their ideas. And if we could do that, you could have regime change. There are plenty of people capable of leading this religion and getting it right as Christian Mormons, not Pharisee Mormons. But it's all going to be on a knife edge, and it's going to have to happen quickly, because at the moment, the vast majority of people who reach that point of crisis just want to run away from the church. They want it to burn down as fast as possible and stop hurting people.
Yeah.
And those of us who stay are very entangled still. Most of our family are still active members, so we can't just run away. It's not an option.
Yeah.
It's
And I
still
think,
fundamental to your marriage and your world.
yeah, I think you're right. I think it's that feeling of, and as you said at the very beginning, you're in quite a unique position of privilege to be able to have this relationship with the church, and it be prickly and uncomfortable, and you are above the parapet for a lot of people's negative attention towards you, and it not be a cost to your economic position, it not be a cost to your relationships with your wife or children. And it's, although it might cause some discomfort with wider family, it's not to the extent that other people are perhaps sitting in. I think it's interesting what you said about the UK losing religion sort of over the last 30 years, it going downhill. But I think that's organised religion, because I think you'd be hard pressed to say that the UK has lost spirituality. And certainly there's other faiths that have grown over that time period that aren't Christian faith. And people have found ways, particularly women, that speak to them more so than patriarchal Christian organisations. And I think, and again, speaking from a convert but female perspective, it'd have to be pretty darn good to convince me that it's got something worth offering me, because I sacrificed a whole lot about myself, and I asked that sacrifice of my children as well to fit into that Mormon paradigm. And I would need to see a huge amount of fundamental changes to accept it, even down to the fact that, you know, the lead church historian has to be a man. Of course it does. You know, the fact that there are fantastic scholarly women
and a lawyer these days, usually a lawyer.
And you know, those are overlooked. All of those things are overlooked because of the way the church has been set up in it, and the institution that it is from the get-go. And that's the same for a lot of religions. I get that sort of thing happens, but we would be so much stronger as any organization if we allowed people to come with all the different viewpoints that are out there, whatever gender, sexuality, you know, all spiritual belief, non-spiritual, you know, non-belief, all of those things should be part of any conversation. And I think it would be amazing to go to something that was organized at a chapel and it not be at all about converting people or sizing people up or judging people, but it was about something that was going to add value to their lives, you know, serving other people, helping create something, helping do something with that would cause change in a community. I don't think the church has ever really utilized its strength of membership to cause good to come about in local communities. Certainly not in the UK. We've worn a few yellow tabards over.
But there's not been enough of us. Yeah, but it's one-off tokenistic events, isn't it?
It is.
There's not.
And it's
can
done
I push
into the end side, isn't it? It's not done with a view to actually bring about positive change within a community.
No, that's right. Can I push back a bit though? I think there is the ghost of, just as the ghost of polygamy still haunts the church, there is the ghost of Christian Mormonism. The reason it did grow is in amongst all the dreck, which I'm not denying at all, there was enough of the Christian community building and service and good and welcome. I think certainly you're better off as an investigator in our church than as a member. as an investigator, they roll out the red carpet. Everyone's pleased to see you. No one's judging you. And they're desperate for you to join and feel welcome. We can do that. How about we do that to all of our members instead of judging them and persecuting them to be worthy of a temple recommend or whatever? And so I think it's all there. And everything you're talking about, here we are as I hope reasonably articulate people. We talk about racism, we talk about feminism, we talk about LGBTQ inclusion, we talk about the changes that need to happen to be a truly welcoming Big Tent Mormonism. We're talking about relationships with other faiths. We are having articulate, informed, passionate conversations about all the things that would solve this mess. And this is my thing. We've got the Mormon church in exile. The Christian Mormons are mostly in exile, but they're a huge brains trust. And even though they personally would be traumatized to set foot in a chapel again, they care, and they certainly care about their close family members who are still living in this community, to say, we'll tell you how to fix it. We'll tell you what we learned. We'll tell you why we had to leave and how you could change that. You've got all this knowledge, and that's partly, again, what my podcast is about. It's trying to be a balance of, here are the problems, you can't fix it till you're honest about them, but here are solutions if you want them. And these are solutions that work. These are solutions from within Mormonism's own scriptures and paradigms. It's not starting a new religion. I'm not claiming to be a prophet, which is a big mistake a lot of reformers make for a start. I'm saying we've already got in our collective wisdom, in our collective more membership and ex-membership, everything we need to fix this. But you've got to have the courage to stand up and start throwing cabbages at the emperor with no clothes. You've got to vote opposed, because you're letting these people do this to your family, to your marriage, to your community, to your wards. They are not worth it. Their peace of mind as they slowly die in bigotry is not worth sacrificing a community of literally millions of people. They're not worth it. Why are we all torturing ourselves, losing our children because of their intolerant bigotries? For 15 men. I mean, it's stupid. I thought we were more intelligent than this. Come on. Sometimes you just need to give people permission to do that. And again, why I want to be in the room to say that every so often. I want them to hear from someone. And I think it's in part because I'm protective of them. They don't think I am. Where I've said in the past, I'm doing this for the next generation of kids. You know, my siblings or whatever might say, well, don't do this in the name of my kids. You know, I'm raising them all and I know what I'm doing, sort of thing. I'm like, yeah, but I'm a bit older than you. I've lost mine. They both went. It's going to happen to you. Don't be naive, you know. So they'll realize later, you know. And it's just you don't want them to go through this pain that everyone around you who's left has already been through, and they will. But there are softer ways to do it. I mean, it's amazing. There are these wonderful communities to help soften the blow now, to give you support as you have your faith transition. But it's amazing. It means people are far less harmed than they used to be, I think, and far less lonely, at least, as they go through it. And it's empowering. The only reason I'm holding this space is because of all the people who've gone there before, and they've shared their experiences. So I know what to expect, and I can then plan ahead and try and do better this time, or survive longer than they did, you know.
And I think it
so
is that,
I think there is that hope.
So I was going to say, I think it is that thing of holding that space open, isn't it? And it's painful because you are caught in that gust of wind blowing through, but you've got to hold it open because there are so many people that you know need to come through and need to understand what's going on and actually make the decision with all of the information, all of the sort of relevant information, so that they don't end up 20 years down the line from now going, what on earth did I do with my life? What decisions did I make that weren't healthy for me because I thought it was true? And everyone was sitting with their fingers on the lips who could have told me, but didn't want to upset me 20 years ago. I wish they'd told me. I wish they'd said something, or at least told me that they were there when I was ready to talk to them, because that maybe I would have made different decisions about what to do with my life.
The saddest things you see in the blogonacle are people our age and older, often in their 70s, 80s, just lamenting the time and opportunities they wasted, particularly women who suppressed their education and career in favor of family when they could have done both. They absolutely could have done both. And none of them are like, I wish I didn't have my children. I love them, but we could have done this differently and in a much healthier way. I mean, that alone is enough for the church to burn down or reform. And with all of this, we're on a really short time limit here. I mean, the church in Britain's already down to 11% active and falling. It will 5 years tops. It will cease to functionally exist. There'll be a few remnants of little elderly clusters, but they'll be closing the buildings. It'll be too far for people to travel. They'll be doing Zoom church from their retirement homes. It's gone, you know. And the same is starting to happen in regions of America and lots of the rest of the world. So there's that as well. If this was going to be a battle for the rest of my life, I'd be like, there's no point. And I think the reason a previous generation of activists eventually gave up and stopped trying is it was still too far away from the end game, that they were banging their head against the wall that wouldn't fall. Now it's falling. That wall is crumbling all over the place. The towers are collapsing. The hordes of apostasy, or whatever you want to call it, of people leaving, it's all here. The tsunami has arrived. The truth wave is destroying the church's credibility. The kids are leaving in droves. They're not signing up to seminary and nonsense anymore. They want truth. They want honesty. They want integrity, and so they should. And the church doesn't deserve any of us. It doesn't deserve any of us. The good it's done has not been enough to outweigh the harm it's done to a lot of people. I think there are a category of people for whom the church is still a safer place than where they were before. There are a lot of very broken, hurt people that it is a great community, and I'm glad it's there for them.
Isn't it? And for some people, the church offered structure that they didn't find in their family environment or their, whatever environment they were in, and the church then becomes a safe haven. But I would still argue that it's better than nothing.
It won't grow
still
like
so
that. But that's it should. My thing, and why I was excited about this religion when I was younger, was I thought at last someone's worked out a Christianity where it isn't just a crutch, where it's not, and I don't mean that flippantly.
No.
I'd much rather people join a religion and get over their addiction and stop beating their wives if that's what it will do for them. Yes, that's better. But this is a religion that should be appealing to people with university education, with no personal crisis going on, who just are curious about truth, curious about why we exist. The big questions. Why am I here? Where am I going? Why is the universe so big? Is there a God? The big philosophical questions that everyone should ask. This church used to have a package that could speak to that really beautifully and powerfully, and say, unlike these other Christian churches, we think you can become a God. And I don't mean that in an arrogant way. I mean in your human potential. If God really is a parent,
claim, but
of course God wants all of his
inspiring.
children to become like him. You're not a loving parent if you're not offering everything you've got to your kids. I mean, it's that simple. And most Christian churches don't even go there. They don't come close to that. That alone is the winning idea in Mormonism. Well, now they're trying to abandon it because they don't know their own doctrine. These idiots, they don't study the scriptures. Prophets used to get up in general conference and boast about how they spent 3 hours praying and studying the scriptures every day. None of them have said anything like that for donkey's years. I can't remember. They're too busy. They're too busy jet setting around the world, and they've given themselves the excuse that any thoughts they have are revelations from God. They're not seeking wisdom in the scriptures anymore. And doesn't it show? They don't know their own religion. They don't know how wrong they're being because they've stopped reading the scriptures that would tell them. It's amazing. And they're getting away with it. No, they're not. People are leaving in droves. They're not getting away with it. It's a disaster.
So what happens is, and the church has always been very good at this. Joseph Smith himself was very good at this, because on the one hand, if God was unhappy with me as a prophet, he'd get rid of me. Joseph Smith is killed as a young man, ostensibly middle-aged at most.
Yeah.
But the church pivots and said, no, he was a sacrificial lamb, essentially. He died at the prime of his life.
He died for the truth.
Yeah, we're not allowed to look at it and go, well, maybe God didn't actually want him to be doing what he was doing. Maybe he was in the wrong there. And then we've got the church, God wouldn't let me lead people astray. Well, people are leaving in droves and saying, you're lying to us and you're telling us untruths and we don't think you're from God. And then they pivot and say, we're being persecuted. Wicked take the truth to be hard. It's the last days. We said that in the last days, the very elect would be deceived. Whatever way you play it,
the house always wins. The house always
got
wins.
An answer baked into the book, and I think,
and people were discussing patriarchal blessings recently. You know, it will happen in life. If he does, all my patriarchal blessing came true. If not, oh, it's okay. It's in the next life.
Yeah.
You know, that was literally gaslit in one of the conference talks. They had two about patriarchal blessings.
Example of Mormon brain thinking, isn't it?
Circular
Everything I tell you
argument.
is true, and the things that don't come true, that's your fault. Well,
or it will happen in the next life, which
you're getting it in the next life. So stop moaning and keep doing what I've told you to do. There was never an opportunity, despite the claims within the book, there's never an opportunity to prove that it is correct, to think about it, think it through in your own mind, and do anything other than just do as you're told. You're not allowed to come to the conclusion that maybe the leaders could be wrong or being misled, or that, in some way that the way that it is structured currently is unhealthy for people or unhealthy for you as an individual. You're not allowed to come to that conclusion. And I would love it to be an organization where that was a possibility, because it would allow people to stay, but have healthy autonomy to say, this is where I'm comfortable and I don't do this. And this is a place where I feel comfortable. I don't believe that. We could all tolerate that.
So can I suggest can I suggest things from within Mormonism that already teach that? So I think from without Mormonism, you've got Fowler stages of faith development. I've found incredibly helpful, because they talk about how Mormons get stuck at level 3, basically, which is where you've got your youthful certainty. You finally put all the pieces together around age 18. Young adults, that's why they're great missionaries, because they can't see any problems. They haven't lived long enough to experience many of them yet. And you have that certainty. Then you start to realize, okay, not everything I was told is correct. This organization isn't perfect. I'm going to start nuancing. And you enter your nuance zone and you renegotiate your relationship with the community. You will, if you want, you will come back into it for what you find value there, but you are not going to let them do unrighteous dominion on you anymore. Your mind is your own, not theirs. And you declare that independence. And that was so wonderful, because it's the process of faith crisis and maturity framed as a step upwards, the fortunate fall, the step up, not the fall down. And that has been really helpful as a model. And it's very true, because that's what we actually experience. And it's not a journey into faithlessness. It's a journey towards realism and truth with faith, if you want it. And much healthier, so that you can progress to the next stage of faith if there is a God. But within Mormonism, the way I go is that there are 6 filters that we can apply. So this is my riposte to Elder Haney, and the others who are like, you just assume everything the leader's saying is true. And if they're contradicting everything they said last week or previous prophets said, it doesn't matter, because they're just true, which is literally insane. So the church taught me 6 filters or ways to judge. If someone's claiming to be speaking from God, they have to pass 6 tests. Any of them on their own can be a bit flaky, but if they can get through all 6, you've got some pretty robust sort of truth claims, I think you can say. So the first is, does it make sense to your rational intelligence? Ponder before you pray. Work it out in your own mind first. We've been given God-given intelligence. We're expected to use it. Secondly, does it have scriptural authority? Is what they're saying compatible with the canonized scriptures, which are somewhat time tested, and at least the organization has authorized them, unlike the family proclamation. 3, Do you have a spiritual witness from God that it's true? Do you, whatever you interpret as God speaking to you, does that happen in association with this idea? Fourth, emotional intelligence. Does this feel like it's coming from a place of love and compassion, the kind of things Jesus taught and modeled? You know, is it emotion? Does it have emotional integrity? Five, is it something, this is something that the prophets themselves have taught recently, particularly D.T.L. Christofferson. Is this something that the leaders of the church have taught consistently over time? Not just one or two big mouths sounding off with their pet hobby horse, but is this something that the living apostles teach consistently? Apostolic authority. And then finally, common consent authority. Number 6. Has this doctrine or policy been sustained by a vote of the membership? Because Doctrine and Covenants is very clear that everything must be done by common consent. And that, of course, means nothing they've done since 1978 we have to pay any attention to whatsoever, because none of it has been offered to us for a common consent vote since they voted to accept ending the racism. So you've got 6 really robust filters there. Again, the scriptures can be flaky. What you interpret as your spiritual promptings might be off a bit. Rational analysis, you might just be getting it wrong today. The apostles might all be saying something dumb, you know, and so on. I think the voting one is a real key. But if you put all of those together, that is a filter system much stronger than the sum of its parts. It's all Mormon kosher. All of it is in the teachings of Mormon prophets and scriptures. So that's what I use. When I go to church, when I listen to General Conference, if it makes sense, if it feels emotionally true, if I feel the Spirit telling me it's true, if it's compatible with scripture, if it's something that they're teaching consistently, and I'm waiting for the vote, you know, and then I'll believe it. Meanwhile, you haven't voted, we've not voted.
Yeah.
I don't have to trust or do anything you say. That's your fault because you didn't do a vote. But the rest,
You feel
that works.
I think for me, one of a really good litmus test is what would happen. What would happen to me if I said to something that other people felt good about, I don't feel good about this? Would I be rejected by the community? Would my opinion be ridiculed? Would I still have the opportunity to voice my concerns, or would I be silenced? And I think that's a good litmus test of whether it's a healthy organization that can handle those tough conversations, because all of those tests are valid to a believing member, as long as you arrive at the conclusion that they want you to arrive at. It's when you follow that process through and you don't arrive at the same conclusion as the one that they're hoping you'll land at, then it's well, you better get on board or clear on out, which is what happened with the Swedish rescue, wasn't it? They were given a time frame to accept what we're teaching or bugger off, because we don't want you around here.
Skedaddle,
And these were valiant, faithful
and
members.
they lost 40% of the members in Sweden. Idiots.
So as an organization, I think they've modeled why those tests, they don't even have a process for what happens if you roll the dice and it doesn't come back with the result that you're hoping for, or your membership does vote opposed. Well, what then? Nemo's done a really great job of kind of pushing that up and up and up, and then in the end it's silence, isn't it? Because there isn't a process, there isn't
they've got nothing.
No, they haven't.
They know they're lying.
Well, and I think they know that it's broken at a fundamental level that we weren't ever supposed to notice or realize, really. But we have spoken for nearly 2 hours, so I want to we need to get out this corridor. Crying out loud, they need to lock up the chapel. So I think from a point of view of, I completely respect, and hats off to you for holding that space and putting yourself in those uncomfortable positions time and time again. I certainly don't want to be there. But I also, for anyone listening to this who kind of feels like, is there space for me as a believing Mormon in spaces like Sunstone or watching your podcast or 21st Century Saints or Nemo or whatever? I promise that it will be challenging to watch it. It is challenging, isn't it? Or I promise you it will be challenging somewhat to the normal comfy slippers that is Mormonism, where it's the echo chamber. But there is so much kindness and compassion in those spaces, because it is people who have sat there 5 years, 10 years, 20 years sometimes before and wanted it to work, desperately wanted it to work. We're desperately trying to make the puzzle pieces fit together and form this coherent picture that we were hoping for. And there's an awful lot of kindness there that, sadly, towards the end of my time at church, I didn't feel I could feel coming back at me from the community at church anymore, because I was making people feel a bit uncomfortable, I think. So yeah, hats off to yourselves, and for anyone that feels like they would like to explore what on earth those conversations are. It's all the same stuff that you talk about at church. It's just talked about without the filter of we've got to arrive at the same conclusion. We're okay with it. We're coming to different answers, aren't we?
And we don't have to ignore our lived experience. You bring it all. Bring everything you know, everything you've experienced. Just own it all and have the conversation. And Hugh B. Brown put it brilliantly in one of his great speeches at BYU, that we have to hold our own in the marketplace of ideas. He said there's no point indoctrinating people or giving them half-truths or whatever, because we've all got to go out there and justify our corner. And if it doesn't survive, it's not worth keeping as a belief. It has to stand up to scrutiny. And the only tactic you've got as a lying totalitarian cult leader is to disconnect everyone from those forums of discussion and dialogue. Disconnect them from social media, stop them talking to the enemy, stop them socializing with non-members, just keep them away from it as much as possible, demonize the other, make them paranoid, and hope that they don't stop, and keep them so busy they don't have time to stop and think and research. And one of the big luxuries of getting off the busy train of Mormonism is suddenly you've got time to actually look stuff up. You know, and you discover how much they hid from you because you never had time to Google check because you're on to the next busy job.
And you read scriptures,
extraordinary.
I read my scriptures a lot, and I did my seminary. I joined the church in time to do my 4 years of seminary, and I was a seminary teacher at one point. But I thought I'd read my scriptures, but then when you realize, when you're going through the lesson manuals and you were told to read verses 1 to 10, and then we're picking it up again at verse 17, and you're thinking,
skip the embarrassing bit.
11 and 16 there. It's very interesting to then go back and sort of look through the stuff that was skipped over, because that's an on purpose. That's not a by accident. And I think
it's proof texting. And as a teacher, you see that it's so obvious. You know, they're very carefully selecting and usually avoiding all the interesting stuff now. I mean, Come Follow Me is like dull as ditch water, mainly because it avoids the really meaty bits of the scriptures. They've disconnected Mormons from the scriptures. Who thought that would ever be possible?
I know,
because we used to have our heads in those things. We used to have to read the lot to graduate seminary.
Memorize huge amounts.
Now they're doing it. And everything I'm doing, all the things I regularly go back to in my podcast is quoting my seminary scriptures. It's like, you taught us to be these people, and people who've left so often say this. You taught us to care. You taught us to have integrity. You taught us to learn and study and research and cross-reference. And now that we've done all that and found you wanting, suddenly we're the worst people on earth. We're the least faithful. We're the lazy learners, when actually, no, we were the ones who did the work, who cared enough, who had integrity to not just go through the motions, but really find out, like you told us to. And now we found out you're not living up to any of that. But you taught it to us, so it's your own fault, sillies.
And there's a grief that
and we're not going away.
It's a sadness there. There's an anger there, certainly for myself sometimes, but there's more than anything. There's a huge amount of grief for
what could have been,
what I wished it was, what I wished I'd found, but that wasn't the case. So but anyway, thank you so much, Peter. I really, really appreciate it, and well done us. Look, I think we've actually recorded something. instead of
Yeah, hopefully.
and not record.
Well, I pushed the right button this time.
Oh, fingers crossed. Fingers crossed. All right, lovely. Thank you so much, and I'm sure we'll catch up again soon.
Oh, absolute pleasure. And thank you so much for this opportunity. Just brilliant. I think we're modeling how it can be. You can have come from very different places and still talk and learn and have a great time. Yeah.
Yeah. Brilliant. Take care. Thank you.
Bye. Recording.